Welcome to the Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
We use the phrase fear and loathing all the time.
Yeah, constantly.
Right. We treat it like this cultural catchphrase or, the dramatic intensifier. Like, it just means two really bad feelings stacked on top of each other.
Which is how most people experience it, sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what if loathing isn't simply an extreme or darker version of fear? What if loathing is actually a structural arrangement that the self builds specifically to hide the fact that it is utterly terrified?
That is the pivotal question.
It really is.
We'll see.
So welcome to the deep dive. We are incredibly glad you're here with us today because we're going to look at human hostility through a completely different lens.
A very precise structural lens.
Yes, and this framework, it completely shifts how you might view the hostilities you observe in the world. When you see intense disdain out there, you might actually start looking for the hidden fragility beneath it.
Because it completely upends our standard assumptions.
Right.
We are going to be conducting an in-depth structural analysis of an essay by R.J. Starr.
Such a fascinating piece of work.
It really is. The piece is titled Fear and Loathing, The Architecture of Defensive Repulsion, and it was published by Deafmark Press.
And this work sits squarely within Starr's broader overarching framework, right?
Yes. The framework known explicitly as psychological architecture.
Okay, let's start right there with psychological architecture, because that term really sets the rules of engagement for our entire conversation today.
It does. It defines the parameters.
Right, because we aren't talking about, fleeting moods or chemical reactions here, are we?
Not at all. The framework of psychological architecture requires us to look at human experience, specifically the experience of the self.
The self, okay.
Yes, the self as a constructed system. We are mapping out a highly coordinated architectural sequence within the self.
So it's about mechanics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The goal here is to examine precisely how the self manages its own exposure and how it maintains its structural boundaries when those boundaries face an existential threat.
Which means we really have to move away from treating fear and loathing as just synonyms, or even just adjacent emotional states.
We have to completely separate them.
Yeah.
Within this framework, they're related, but they're entirely distinct events.
And they're separated by a mechanical transformation.
Right, a transformation that occurs strictly inside the self.
Okay, so let's get into the very first step of this sequence, stage one, which is fear.
The necessary starting point.
Yeah, because in everyday conversation, we treat fear as just a reaction to danger. Like a threat appears and the self feels afraid.
That's the conventional understanding.
But Starr completely redefines this. He strips away the requirement of physical danger entirely.
He does. He insists that fear must be understood structurally, specifically as exposure and vulnerability.
Right. So if we aren't talking about physical safety, what exactly is the self registering when it experiences fear in this the structural sense?
Well, when the self experiences fear in Starr's framework, it is registering a felt recognition.
A felt recognition of what?
That something outside of its control possesses the power to harm, displace, humiliate, or completely unmake the story by which the self understands itself.
Wow. Okay, so it's about the narrative.
Exactly. The self is realizing, in a very sudden and acute way, that its boundary is permeable.
Permeable, meaning it's not closed off.
Right. It's an admission by the self that it is not sealed off from the external world. Something beyond its own command actually has the standing to unsettle its internal condition.
I want to push on that idea, the story by which the self understands itself.
It's a crucial concept.
Because if the physical body isn't in danger, the self must be terrified of losing something else. So what is the actual structural property that the self feels is being threatened?
The self is afraid of losing its coherence.
Its coherence.
Yes. The self relies on a specific narrative, an internal architecture to understand who and what it is and what its value is. So when the self encounters an object or a reality that contradicts that narrative, the self is placed in a position of extreme vulnerability.
It's facing a structural destabilization.
Precisely. The self realizes that the narrative it has painstakingly constructed is entirely subject to alteration.
Or even total collapse, right?
Yes, total collapse by forces it simply cannot dictate or control.
I think we really need to ground this in the mechanics of R.J. Starr's specific illustrations.
That would be helpful, yes.
Because it sounds a bit abstract until you see it actually operating in the world. So let's look at the fear of aging.
A perfect example.
Yeah, in a structural sense, the self fears aging not due to, momentary physical pain.
No, the pain is secondary.
Right. It is terrified of what aging threatens structure. So how does psychological architecture explain the exposure that comes with aging?
Well, we have to look at how the self has organized its identity prior to the onset of aging.
Okay.
Frequently, the self constructs a structural narrative of competence, attractiveness, or relevance.
So it builds itself around those traits.
Yes, the self builds its coherence upon the premise that it possesses those traits, and it actively relies on external feedback to confirm this structure.
The self says, I am relevant, I am capable, and the world affirms this.
Exactly. But then aging introduces an undeniable physical reality that this standing is altering.
So when the self observes its own aging, it isn't just noticing a biological fact.
Not all.
It is experiencing a profound structural vulnerability.
It is. The self recognizes that a fundamental pillar of its identity, this established narrative of relevance or competence, is being dismantled by time.
And time is a force entirely outside of the self's control.
That lack of control is the crucial element here. The fear of aging is the self's registration of that exact exposure.
It sees that its boundary cannot repel the aging process.
Right. The story the self uses to understand itself is threatened with becoming obsolete or invalid.
Which means the self is forced to acknowledge that it's subject to a condition that will displace its current structural standing.
And this generates profound discomfort, because the self is accustomed to experiencing itself as central, capable, and enduring.
So to suddenly feel that this centrality is expiring...
It's a structural crisis.
Yeah, a complete crisis. And because the self cannot control this process, it feels this exposure as a direct threat to its coherence. It feels unmade.
That's a good way to put it.
Which brings up Starr's second illustration, which I think is equally fascinating, the fear of new technology.
Yes, the technological threat.
Right, because again, the self fears a new technology, not because the technology is physically dangerous to life and limb. It fears what the technology threatens structurally.
Exactly.
So how does the self process a technological advancement as a threat to its boundary?
In this scenario, the self has built its identity around a specific skill, a specific role, or a specific form of distinctiveness within its environment.
Okay.
The self understands its value, and it's standing through its ability to perform this role. The self's narrative is, I am necessary because I alone can do this.
Right.
So when a new technology emerges that can replicate or render that specific skill unnecessary, the self experiences acute structural exposure.
The technology is an external object that possesses the power to make the self's distinctiveness obsolete.
Precisely. The technology threatens to erase the self's standing.
I find it so fascinating how evident the permeability of the self's boundary is here.
It is entirely exposed.
Because the self cannot stop the new technology from existing. It's just out in the world doing what it does. Therefore, the self's narrative, the story that says, I am necessary, is fundamentally unmade by the mere presence of this new object.
And the fear is the self's realization that its position is fragile. It is placed in a position it cannot fully control.
Positioned beneath the threat of irrelevance.
Yes. Vulnerability is the absolute substance of this fear. To be afraid, in Starr's framework, is for the self to admit that something else has the standing to unsettle the structure of its experience.
And this brings us to a major structural turning point. Because the self finds this state of vulnerability, this exposure to aging or to a new technology, to be entirely intolerable.
It cannot abide it.
Right. The self cannot simply remain in a state where it acknowledges its own impending irrelevance or displacement.
No, the discomfort of recognizing its own permeable boundary demands a resolution.
So the self that feels exposed actively seeks an end to that exposure.
It does. However, in the sequence Starr outlines, the self does not seek resolution through adaptation.
Okay, that's key.
It does not integrate the new reality of aging or the new reality of the technology. Instead, the self seeks resolution by altering its structural arrangement to the threatening object.
Which introduces stage 2 of the sequence.
Yes.
How exactly does the self resolve this intolerable exposure if it refuses to adapt? Starr introduces loathing here, and we really need to define this with absolute precision.
We do, because it's often misunderstood.
Right, because in psychological architecture, loathing is not an intensified dislike. It isn't a heightened emotional degree of disgust.
No, it is not an emotion in that sense.
Starr defines loathing strictly as distance and restored standing. Can we examine the mechanics of that?
This is a foundational concept in the framework. Loathing structurally rebuilds the self's relationship to the feared object.
Okay, how so?
Well, in stage 1, fear leaves the self exposed and positioned below the threat. The self is anxiously attentive to the object because the object holds power over it.
The self is basically looking up at the threat.
Exactly. Loathing alters this internal architecture completely. Loathing pushes the object away and recasts the entire relationship as one of separation.
So the object is demoted.
Yes.
The self takes the object, whether that's the reality of aging or the new technology, and marks it as inferior, as contaminating, or as unworthy.
And by doing this, the self creates distance.
Right. It is no longer in proximity to something that holds power over it. It is in proximity to something it considers beneath it.
That is the mechanical shift. And this provides a massive structural benefit to the self.
Jits.
Loathing carries a built-in posture of elevation. The self that despises an object has, by the sheer act of despising, positioned itself above that object.
Wow. Okay.
Fear strips away the self's standing by exposing its fragility. Loathing restores that standing by manufacturing a structural hierarchy where the self is dominant and the object is fundamentally flawed.
Okay, I have a serious theoretical question regarding this transition.
Go ahead.
When the self moves from fear to loathing, does the feared object itself actually change in any way during this stage? Or is it strictly the self's architectural arrangement to the object that changes?
It is purely an internal structural rearrangement of the self. The object remains exactly what it was.
It doesn't change at all.
Not at all. The new technology functions in the exact same manner it did yesterday. The reality of aging continues at the exact same pace.
So what actually happens?
What changes is how the self organizes its boundary relative to the object. The self avoids examining its own vulnerability by redirecting its entire focus onto the supposed deficiencies of the object.
Right. So the self doesn't have to say, I am deeply afraid of becoming irrelevant because of this technology.
No, that would be an admission of exposure.
Instead, the self can just declare that technology is ridiculous, it is flawed, it is a sign of societal decay, and it is entirely beneath my concern.
Exactly. The underlying fear is permitted to remain completely unexamined because the self has successfully substituted structural exposure with structural elevation.
And this elevation is what makes loathing so remarkably efficient.
It is highly efficient.
It resolves the acute discomfort of fear without requiring the self to do the difficult work of acknowledging its own permeability. The self escapes the vulnerability by erecting a boundary of contempt.
Yes. It is a brilliant, albeit defensive structural maneuver.
So we have this massive, coordinated effort where the self takes its vulnerability, demotes the object, and builds this boundary of contempt. But how does that actually happen?
It doesn't happen all at once.
Right, which brings us to stage 3. R.J. Starr explains that this conversion from fear to loathing isn't an instantaneous magical event. It's a highly mechanical, step-by-step process.
A sequential process.
Yes, moving sequentially through the 4 domains of psychological architecture. So we need to dissect each domain to understand the full structure of this conversion.
Let's do that.
Starting with the first domain, mind.
Mind is where the structural work originates. The action that mind takes is classification. Mind classifies the object as threatening.
Let's look closely at the mechanics of this classification. Mind is performing the interpretive work for the self, correct?
Correct.
Mind is the domain that evaluates the external object and decides that it has crossed from a neutral presence in the world to a dangerous reality for the self.
It establishes the foundational premise that something is a problem.
But what are the specific criteria mind uses to make this classification?
Mind evaluates whether the object has the capacity to destabilize the self's narrative.
Ah.
The interpretive work of mind is crucial because it sets the coordinates for the rest of the architecture. Mind looks at the new technology and interprets it not as a neutral development in engineering, but as a specific targeted threat to the self's continued relevance.
It categorizes the object as a source of destabilization.
Exactly.
I want to highlight how extraordinary it is that mind can interpret threats to status or self-understanding with the exact same seriousness it applies to physical threats.
It is a remarkable equivalence.
Because the classification by mind does not require a physical danger at all, it only requires a structural threat to the self's coherence.
That is a key insight. Once mind has classified the object as a structural threat, the sequence immediately moves to the second domain, emotion.
Okay, emotion. What is its action?
The action taken by emotion is to charge the object and to reroute the self's exposure into aversion.
This rerouting mechanism is absolutely vital. The self feels exposed due to the classification made by mind, but emotion disguises this exposure.
Yes.
It surfaces as irritation, as disgust, or as outrage. But I have to question the timing of this.
How so?
How does emotion reroute this exposure so quickly? It seems to happen before the self engages in any conscious reflection about being afraid.
It happens rapidly because the discomfort of exposure is structurally intolerable to the self.
Okay.
The self feels something it adamantly does not want to feel, vulnerability. The self cannot linger in that state.
So it has to act immediately.
Right. Emotion acts as an immediate redirective mechanism. Instead of the self processing the internal data which says, I am afraid, emotion attaches a highly negative charge to the external object.
The self turns the feeling outward.
Exactly.
So the self effectively avoids its own internal condition. Instead of looking inward and acknowledging the fragility of its own coherence, the self looks outward and says, there is something inherently wrong with that object.
Emotion translates internal vulnerability into external aversion.
That is the precise rerouting. The self avoids the admission of fear by substituting it with a charge of hostility or disgust toward the object.
And the self begins to focus entirely on the repulsive qualities of the object rather than its own internal state of threat.
And this transition leads directly into the third domain, identity.
Yes.
This is where the structural shift becomes formalized. Identity acts as the seat of boundary defense for the self.
The primary defender.
Right. The action taken by identity is the expulsion of the object across the boundary.
This is the critical structural shift in R.J. Starr's framework.
Because up until this point, the object was just unsettling, right? And it was charged with aversion by emotion.
Yes, but within the domain of identity, the object is transformed into a boundary marker.
The self formally declares, that is not me.
The self defines its own edges by determining what must remain strictly outside of them.
So the object is no longer just something the self dislikes. Its exclusion becomes structurally necessary for the self to remain coherent.
It is an imperative.
The self draws a definitive line, places the feared object on the outside, and builds its sense of self on the fact that it's completely separated from that object.
Precisely.
But I'm curious about the variance here. Do all selves expel objects with the same force?
Not at all. The nature and violence of this expulsion is dictated entirely by the condition of the self's identity.
Meaning?
Fragile identities require far more aggressive expulsions to maintain their coherence.
Okay.
A securely organized identity might tolerate proximity to an unsettling object without its structural integrity collapsing. It might disagree with the object, but it doesn't need to violently expel it.
Because it's secure.
Right. But a defensively constructed identity cannot afford that tolerance.
Because the fragile identity relies entirely on its rigid boundaries for stability.
Exactly.
If the boundary is breached, the self feels it will be completely unmade. Therefore, the more fragile the self's identity, the more forcefully it must expel the object. And the more grotesque or inferior it must render the object to ensure the boundary holds.
That extreme diminishment of the object is what guarantees the self's continued sense of standing. Identity's expulsion secures the distance that loathing absolutely requires.
Which brings us to the fourth and final domain in the conversion sequence.
The domain of meaning.
Right, meaning. The action taken by meaning is to declare the expulsion justified.
It applies the final layer.
The self surrounds the loathing and the boundary created by identity with a moral, cultural, or intellectual explanation.
Meaning applies an architecture of conviction to the defense.
Architecture of conviction. I like that.
The feared object is not simply placed outside the boundary of the self. It is structurally defined as wrong, corrupt, or illegitimate.
So meaning dictates that the self is not merely avoiding discomfort, but is actually perceiving the true flawed nature of the object.
Exactly. It validates the entire process.
But I'm struggling with the sequence here.
Why is that?
Why does meaning come last? Structurally, why doesn't the self need the moral or intellectual justification before it enacts the expulsion through identity? If the self is in a state of structural panic, how does it have the presence of mind to invent a moral justification afterward?
The sequence is dictated by necessity. The expulsion by identity happens out of immediate structural necessity.
Okay.
The self faces an intolerable exposure and must defend its boundary instantly to prevent a collapse of coherence. The defense is a mechanical imperative.
It has to happen right then.
Right. The intellectual or moral justification provided by meaning is applied after the fact to lock that boundary in place permanently.
Okay. So meaning's function is to prevent the self from ever questioning the boundary it just built out of panic.
Yes.
By declaring the expulsion entirely justified, meaning ensures that the self never looks back and realizes that the expulsion was driven by fear.
That is meaning's defining role in this sequence.
Here.
It removes the loathing from the category of things that might require examination by the self.
Once the self has applied meaning to the expulsion, the self experiences its own posture not as a defense, but as an objective truth. The self operates from a position of absolute clarity, completely unaware of the structural work it just performed to hide its own vulnerability.
It is entirely blind to its own mechanics.
So if the self is doing all that massive coordinated work where mind classifies, emotion charges, identity expels, and meaning justifies, we can't just call this generic dislike.
No, that would be inaccurate.
It's an active architectural defense, which is exactly why Starr refuses to use the word hatred and insists on a very specific term for this entire conversion.
Right.
This brings us to stage 4. R.J. Starr introduces the term defensive repulsion.
We must contextualize defensive repulsion within Starr's broader framework of psychological architecture.
Specifically where?
Specifically within a concept located in the identity domain known as defensive self-construction.
Defensive self-construction.
Yes. This occurs when the self organizes its identity primarily around protection, rather than an accurate accounting of its own experience.
Okay.
Defensive repulsion is a primary instrument used by a defensively constructed self.
So it demands that we view the loathing not merely as a feeling, but as psychological work being performed by the self.
It is heavy labor.
It forces the recognition that this is an architectural arrangement. It is a structure designed for a singular, specific purpose, restoring the coherence that fear initially disturbed.
If we simply call it hatred, we obscure the mechanics. We miss the fact that it is a highly coordinated structure built to manage exposure.
And because defensive repulsion is essentially a structural defense, we are forced to ask a very difficult question, which brings us to stage 5.
The hidden contents.
Yes. What exactly is defensive repulsion hiding? If the self is utilizing this architecture to maintain its boundary, it is actively concealing specific unresolved material.
Starr identifies 5 hidden psychological contents that reside beneath the structure of loathing.
We need to spend significant time unpacking the mechanics of each of these because this is where the theory gets profoundly revealing.
Let's go through them.
The first hidden content is the fear of the self's own decline.
We discussed this heavily with the illustration of aging, but we need to look at the structural mechanics of how decline is hidden.
Right.
The loathing of physical changes, or the profound disdain for those who display aging or weakness, is the self's mechanism for hiding its deep fear that its own structural coherence is subject to deterioration.
The self simply refuses to integrate the reality that it is temporary.
Exactly.
So when it encounters decline, it doesn't feel sadness or acceptance. It feels exposure.
It feels threatened.
And the self hides its dread of decline behind a rigid boundary of contempt. By loathing the decline in the object, the self manufactures a delusion of its own permanence.
The self says, I'm not like that, therefore I am not declining.
The self structurally separates itself from the reality of deterioration.
Yes. Which leads to the second hidden content sleep identifies.
Yeah.
Envy of what the object possesses.
Okay, this is a complex structural dynamic. Let's really break this down. The self sees an external object that possesses a trait, a standing, or a resource that the self desires but lacks. Acknowledging this lack would expose the self to vulnerability, right? It would diminish the self's own standing to admit, I do not have this and I want it.
That would be a massive structural admission.
So instead of integrating the reality of this lack, the self deploys defensive repulsion.
It is a brilliant structural evasion. The self cannot tolerate the exposure of wanting something it cannot have.
Because the lack threatens the self's narrative of completeness.
So the self converts the lack into illegitimacy. The self declares the desired trait, or the object possessing it, as corrupt, superficial, or unearned.
The self essentially says, I don't like that. I reject that.
Exactly.
By loathing the object, the self structurally distances itself from its own envy. It covers the pain of the lack with the elevation of contempt.
It is a way of maintaining superiority while secretly harboring desire.
Which transitions perfectly to the third hidden content. Shame about a resemblance the self refuses to acknowledge.
This occurs when the external object reflects a property, a flaw, or a tendency that exists within the self, but which the self has forcefully excluded from its accepted narrative.
Okay, give me an example. Let's say the self is highly disorganized, but has built an identity around being perfectly controlled.
Right.
If the self encounters someone who is disorganized and recognizes that resemblance, its carefully constructed boundary would collapse.
Therefore, the self must intensely loathe the object to prove, structurally, that absolutely no resemblance exists.
Whoa.
The expulsion is the self's attempt to distance itself from its own disowned material. The intensity of the loathing serves as structural proof to the self that it is nothing like the object.
The self says, I hate that trait in them so much, it is impossible for that trait to exist in me.
And precisely.
The loathing is actually directed at the self's own disowned material, but it is projected safely across the boundary onto the object.
Now, the fourth hidden content is desire that cannot be integrated into the self's accepted narrative.
Let's explore why desire can be so threatening. If the self experiences a desire, perhaps an attraction, an ambition, or an interest that fundamentally contradicts its established architecture of identity and meaning, the self faces a structural crisis.
Because admitting the desire would require the self to unmake its coherence and build a new narrative.
And the self finds that unmaking too costly.
It does.
To resolve this, the self converts the exposure of that forbidden desire into profound aversion. The self violently expels the object of desire to maintain the integrity of its existing narrative.
The self cannot integrate the desire, so it must aggressively loathe the object to ensure the boundary remains impenetrable.
The loathing is the self's way of structurally ensuring it never acts on the desire that would destroy its coherence.
Exactly. And finally, the fifth hidden content Starr outlines is grief for something the object's existence makes newly visible as lost.
This is perhaps the most poignant of the structural concealment.
Deeply tragic structurally.
Oh, the object serves as a structural reminder of a loss the self has not processed. The presence of the object exposes a void within the self.
The self encounters an object that possesses a joy, a connection, or a history that the self has lost.
And the object's mere existence forces the self to look at the void.
Yes.
But because the self cannot bear the vulnerability of that grief, because true grief requires a massive surrender of structural control, the self converts the pain of the reminder into loathing toward the object itself.
The self attacks the reminder to avoid the grief. In all 5 of these instances, the defensive repulsion is performing incredibly heavy structural labor.
It is actively keeping the self's unresolved, unintegrated material firmly outside of conscious reach.
That is its primary function.
That raises a critical point about the self's awareness. If the self is putting such an enormous amount of coordinated energy moving sequentially through mind, emotion, identity, and meaning into this defensive repulsion, does this mean the self is entirely oblivious to these hidden contents?
Yes.
Does the self know it is hiding its own envy or grief?
The self is profoundly unaware. The architectural work of defensive repulsion operates entirely beneath the level of deliberate reflection.
It doesn't see it happening.
The self genuinely experiences its contempt as a highly accurate, objective response to the object's supposed flaws. It does not experience its loathing as a structure built to manage its own exposure.
And the entire structural purpose of the meaning domain's justification is to ensure the self never realizes the subconscious nature of this work.
That's precisely what meaning accomplishes.
This lack of awareness is what makes the structure so incredibly durable. The self is completely convinced by the architecture it just built.
It believes its own defense.
And this brings us to a fascinating structural rule in stage 6, which R.J. Starr terms the proximity principle. I think this is where the framework becomes truly counterintuitive.
It goes against common sense.
Right. We normally think we hate things that are totally alien to us. We assume the further away something is from our understanding, the worse the aversion.
But Starr says the opposite.
The principle states that the intensity of the loathing tracks proximity, not danger.
This is a vital component of the framework. Structurally, the self will not exhibit the strongest aversion toward objects that pose the greatest objective danger or that are the most different from the self.
Okay.
Objects that are genuinely remote from the self's internal narrative generate indifference, not loathing.
The self simply does not care about things that are far removed from its structural concerns. It doesn't waste energy on them.
Exactly.
The self only bothers to build massive, coordinated defenses against things that are threateningly near to its own unresolved material.
It requires proximity.
The self loathes most fiercely what has come closest to exposing something the self cannot yet integrate.
To illustrate this proximity principle, Starr provides two precise examples.
Let's look at them.
Let us examine the first, the romantic rival.
Okay.
In a situation involving a romantic rival, hostility runs strongest in the self that is least secure in its own desirability.
Let's trace the structural mechanics of this because it's brilliant.
Please do.
The romantic rival does not necessarily pose any physical danger to the self. What the rival does is come into direct, agonizing proximity with the self's fragile narrative.
Yes.
If the self has a defensively constructed identity based on a tenuous, anxious claim of being chosen or irreplaceable, the very existence of the rival exposes that fragility.
The self's boundary is threatened not strictly by the rival's actions, but by the self's internal proximity to its own deep insecurity.
Because if the self were entirely secure, the rival would be an annoyance, perhaps an object of competition, but not an object of intense loathing.
Exactly.
The intensity of the loathing directed at the rival is an exact structural measure of how close the rival has come to exposing the self's hidden fear of being undesirable.
The self expels the rival with extreme prejudice to structurally reinforce its own threatened standing. The loathing isn't about the rival, it's about the self's proximity to its own terror of abandonment.
Which brings us to the second illustration of the proximity principle, which involves an intellectual position. Starr notes that disdain for an opposing intellectual position runs strongest in those whose own position feels least settled.
This follows the exact same structural logic. The self has built its coherence, and it's standing upon a specific intellectual framework.
Okay.
If that framework is entirely secure, if the self has fully integrated the concepts and is comfortable with nuance, an opposing position is merely an object in the world.
It's just an idea out there.
Right. It might be disagreed with, debated, or dismissed, but it does not threaten the self's architecture.
However, if the self's own intellectual position is secretly unsettled, if the self harbors unintegrated doubts, or recognizes structural flaws in its own argument that it refuses to admit, the opposing position becomes a massive threat.
Because it is too close.
The opposing position comes into sheer proximity with the self's hidden uncertainty.
And because the self cannot tolerate the vulnerability of admitting its own intellectual foundation is unstable, it must deploy defensive repulsion.
The self does not merely critique the opposing position, it loathes it.
Yeah.
It marks the opposing position as stupid, corrupt, or dangerous. The intensity of that disdain is driven entirely by the opposing position's proximity to the self's own unresolved doubt.
It is incredibly counterintuitive. As we noted, we assume we hate what is furthest from us.
But structurally, defensive repulsion requires proximity. The self only requires a structural defense when the threat is at the boundary. If the threat is miles away, the self remains indifferent.
That is the core of the proximity principle. The intensity of the repulsion maps directly onto the self's proximity to its own unintegrated material.
This forces us to confront stage 7. Because if we follow this logic blindly, we might assume every single disagreement is a secret insecurity.
Which is a dangerous misreading.
So we have to introduce a crucial caveat to R.J. Starr's entire theory. The caveat is this: not all aversion is defensive.
It is imperative to state this clearly. The framework of psychological architecture does not suggest that every rejected object is secretly a hidden fragility of the self.
Right. Some threats are entirely real, some dangers warrant immediate recognition and avoidance, and some revulsion is a legitimate response to objects that are genuinely harmful, destructive, or malevolent.
The self does possess the capacity for legitimate moral judgment.
There are times when mind accurately classifies a real threat, emotion appropriately charges it, identity correctly maintains a boundary against it, and meaning validly justifies that boundary based on actual objective properties of the object.
Defensive repulsion is a specific structural mechanism used to manage vulnerability. It is not the only way the self interacts with the world.
But this introduces a profound internal dilemma for the self.
The dilemma of indistinguishability.
Yes, because defensive repulsion and legitimate moral judgment feel absolutely identical from the inside.
They do.
When the self deploys defensive repulsion, it experiences a sense of clarity, moral certainty, and a firm resistance to counter-evidence. When the self exercises legitimate moral judgment, it experiences the exact same internal sensations.
Structurally, meaning performs the same function in both scenarios. Meaning locks down the boundary and dictates that the self's posture is accurate and justified.
Right.
Because meaning forecloses self-inquiry in both cases, the self cannot simply look inward to determine which process is occurring. The internal experience of clarity is indistinguishable.
This is the inevitable question. If they feel exactly the same internally, and meaning has effectively locked down all structural self-inquiry, how can the self ever differentiate between legitimate moral judgment and defensive repulsion?
It's the central problem for the self.
If the self is utterly convinced it is right, how does it know if it is defending a profound truth or just hiding a deep vulnerability?
To answer that, we move to stage 8. Since the self cannot rely on its internal feeling of certainty, R.J. Starr provides 3 specific, observable signals that indicate defensive repulsion is at play, rather than legitimate moral judgment.
These signals are structural behaviors that occur when the self's architecture is defensive. Let's analyze these 3 signals deeply.
The first signal is disproportionate intensity.
We discussed this briefly with the proximity principle, but let's look at the mechanics. The intensity of the self's reaction is vastly disproportionate to the object's actual conduct or properties.
When legitimate moral judgment is operating, the self's aversion scales appropriately with the reality of the object.
Right. A minor offense generates a minor aversion.
Exactly. But when defensive repulsion is operating, the loathing is doing heavy structural work to conceal internal fragility.
So the intensity of the reaction is fueled not by the object, but by the size of the self's own unintegrated fear.
Yes. If the self's reaction seems overwhelmingly massive, frantic, or obsessive compared to what the object actually is or does, it is a clear signal that the self is defending its own boundary, not objectively evaluating the object.
The second signal is escalation under examination. When the self's reaction is questioned, or when the self is presented with counter-evidence regarding the object, how does the self respond structurally?
If the self is operating from legitimate moral judgment, new information or closer examination allows the self to steady into a rational critique.
Because its coherence isn't at stake.
Right. The self can evaluate the data. It can calmly explain why the boundary exists.
But if the self is operating from defensive repulsion, examination is a direct existential threat to its architecture.
The self cannot steady itself. It must escalate.
The self becomes more hostile, more rigid, and more deeply entrenched in its loathing because the examination is threatening to expose the hidden vulnerability.
Yes. The self views the examination not as an inquiry into facts, but as an attack on its structural integrity. Therefore, escalation is the only available structural defense.
And this leads to the third and final signal: absence of curiosity.
This is perhaps the most telling.
There is a notable, forceful lack of curiosity within the self regarding why the object provoked such a strong response in the first place. The self actively resists the question, why does this disturb me?
It perfectly demonstrates the domain of meaning doing its job.
Meaning's entire structural purpose in defensive repulsion is to shut down investigation to protect identity.
Exactly. If the self were to become curious, if it were to actually investigate its own disturbance, it would risk unmaking the very boundary it just panicked to build.
Curiosity is structurally dangerous to a defensively constructed self.
Legitimate moral judgment can withstand curiosity. It welcomes investigation.
But defensive repulsion cannot.
No. The absolute aggressive refusal by the self to examine its own internal reaction is the clearest structural signal that the loathing is an architectural defense mechanism designed to manage exposure.
This brings us to the close of our structural analysis. We must draw this deep dive to its final point regarding the construction of the self.
It is a profound realization.
R.J. Starr's framework demonstrates that identity is built not merely from what the self affirms, but fundamentally from what the self expels.
The boundaries of the self are defined precisely by the objects it places outside of itself.
And as we synthesize this entire architecture, the central thesis emerges. The objects that the self expels with the greatest intensity are frequently those that have come closest to exposing something the self has not yet found a way to integrate.
The self utilizes fear and loathing, not as passing emotions, but as a rigid, sequential architecture to manage its own fragility.
The sequence moves from exposure to expulsion, allowing the self to maintain a false coherence at the immense expense of its own self-knowledge.
Which leaves us with R.J. Starr's central architectural thesis on the matter, summarizing the entire sequence.
What is that final point?
What the self cannot bear to fear directly, it often learns to despise.
What the self cannot bear to fear directly, it often learns to despise. Which raises a final question for us to ponder as we close. If our boundaries are built out of the things we have expelled, what would happen to the architecture of the self if we simply stopped pushing things away? What would remain? We thank you for joining us for this deep dive into R.J. Starr's psychological architecture framework. Until next time.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.